August 23, 2015, began as an ordinary Sunday evening in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. The sun was setting over rural southwestern Louisiana, casting long shadows across Highway 190, a quiet two-lane road that cuts through farmland and scattered communities near Lake Charles. For Louisiana State Police Trooper Stephen Vincent, it was just another shift on patrol, responding to calls and keeping the roadway safe. But that evening, a routine stop to assist a motorist in distress would lead to tragedy, transforming Vincent into a fallen hero and making Kevin Daigle one of Louisiana's most notorious cop killers. Stephen Vincent was 43 years old, a devoted husband, father, and law enforcement officer who had dedicated his career to public service. He joined the Louisiana State Police and became known among colleagues as professional, compassionate, and deeply committed to his community. Vincent was the kind of officer who stopped to help stranded motorists, who treated people with respect regardless of circumstances, and who embodied the values of service above self. He left behind a wife and children who adored him, a department that mourned him deeply, and a legacy that would inspire policy changes and a major drug enforcement operation named in his honor. Kevin Daigle was 54 years old in August 2015, a man whose life had been marked by chronic alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. Born and raised in Louisiana, Daigle had accumulated a lengthy criminal record over decades, including multiple DUI convictions, assault charges, and other serious offenses. Friends and acquaintances described him as volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous when intoxicated. Medical records and court testimony would later reveal a man suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the effects of multiple concussions from vehicle crashes, substance abuse disorders, and possible cognitive decline. But none of these factors would excuse what happened that August evening. On the afternoon of August 23, 2015, Kevin Daigle was driving drunk along Highway 190 near the community of Lacassine in rural Calcasieu Parish. At some point, he lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a roadside ditch, leaving his truck disabled and stuck. The crash was not unusual for Daigle, who had a history of impaired driving incidents. What made this crash different was what would happen next. Trooper Stephen Vincent, responding to reports of a vehicle in the ditch, arrived at the scene to offer assistance. It was approximately 8 p.m. and the sky was darkening. Vincent activated his dashboard camera as he approached, a standard procedure that would later provide crucial evidence of the encounter. The dash cam footage captured the entire interaction between Vincent and Daigle. Vincent approached the disabled vehicle, checking on the driver's condition and assessing the situation. Daigle appeared intoxicated, stumbling, and uncooperative. Vincent remained calm and professional, attempting to speak with Daigle and determine whether he needed medical attention or was capable of making arrangements to remove his vehicle from the ditch. But Daigle had other plans. Without warning, he produced a handgun and aimed it directly at Trooper Vincent. Vincent, recognizing the immediate threat, began to retreat, moving away from Daigle and attempting to create distance. But Daigle pursued him, closing the gap. Then, at close range, Kevin Daigle fired his weapon, shooting Stephen Vincent in the head. The trooper collapsed to the ground, critically wounded. The dashcam continued recording as Daigle stood over the fallen officer. What happened next shocked investigators, prosecutors, and eventually jurors who would watch the footage during trial. Daigle did not flee immediately. Instead, he rifled through Vincent's pockets, searching for keys to the trooper's patrol unit. As he did so, Daigle taunted the dying officer, mocking him as Vincent lay helpless and bleeding on the pavement. The cruelty of the act was almost incomprehensible. Daigle then took Vincent's keys, climbed into the state police cruiser, and attempted to drive away from the scene. But nearby residents and passing motorists had witnessed the shooting or heard the gunfire. Several individuals pursued Daigle, determined not to let him escape. Among them was a local resident who later described the harrowing moments of chasing down the armed suspect. "All I could think about was stopping him," the witness told reporters. The pursuers managed to corner Daigle and physically subdue him, using Trooper Vincent's own handcuffs to restrain the suspect until additional law enforcement arrived. The swift actions of these brave civilians prevented Daigle from fleeing and potentially harming others. They were later credited with ensuring justice for Trooper Vincent. Emergency medical personnel transported Stephen Vincent to a nearby hospital where doctors fought to save his life. But the gunshot wound to his head was catastrophic. On August 24, 2015, one day after the shooting, Trooper Stephen Vincent succumbed to his injuries. He was 43 years old, a husband, a father, and a hero who died trying to help someone in need. The Louisiana State Police issued a statement mourning the loss of one of their own, describing Vincent as an exemplary officer whose dedication to duty cost him his life. As investigators began piecing together the events of August 23rd, they made another grim discovery. On August 24th, authorities found the body of Blake Brewer, a 54-year-old man who had been Kevin Daigle's roommate. Brewer had been murdered in the Moss Bluff home he shared with Daigle, shot to death sometime before Daigle's encounter with Trooper Vincent. The timeline suggested that Daigle had killed his roommate earlier that day, then left the residence, drove while intoxicated, crashed his vehicle, and subsequently murdered the trooper who stopped to help him. Prosecutors would later argue that Daigle killed Brewer and then panicked, leading to the violent confrontation with Vincent when the officer arrived at the crash scene. Daigle was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Trooper Stephen Vincent, second-degree murder in the death of Blake Brewer, motor vehicle theft, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Calcasieu Parish District Attorney John DeRossier announced that prosecutors would seek the death penalty for Vincent's murder, citing the aggravated circumstances of killing a law enforcement officer in the line of duty. Daigle was held without bond as the case moved through the legal system. The community response was overwhelming. Trooper Vincent's funeral drew thousands of mourners, including law enforcement officers from across Louisiana and neighboring states. A procession of police vehicles stretched for miles, a powerful testament to the respect and admiration Vincent commanded among his peers. His family spoke of their devastating loss, describing a devoted husband and father whose absence left an unfillable void. Governor Bobby Jindal ordered flags flown at half-staff in Vincent's honor. The Louisiana State Police established the Trooper Stephen Vincent Memorial Fund to support his family and ensure his legacy would endure. In the months and years following the murder, law enforcement agencies launched Operation Trooper Stephen Vincent, a major drug enforcement initiative aimed at combating the narcotics trade in southwestern Louisiana. The operation was named in honor of the fallen trooper, symbolizing the ongoing fight against the criminal elements that had claimed his life. But critics later raised concerns about the operation's tactics and outcomes, questioning whether it truly honored Vincent's memory or exploited his death for political purposes. Regardless of the debates, the operation underscored the lasting impact of Vincent's murder on law enforcement and policy in Louisiana. The legal proceedings against Kevin Daigle stretched over several years. In 2019, Daigle stood trial for the first-degree murder of Trooper Stephen Vincent. The trial, held in Calcasieu Parish, featured testimony from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, medical examiners, and civilian witnesses who had helped apprehend Daigle. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the dashcam footage from Vincent's patrol unit, which captured the encounter in horrifying detail. Jurors watched as Daigle shot the trooper, rifled through his pockets, and taunted him. The video left no doubt about Daigle's guilt. Prosecutor Leah Hall told the jury that the crime was particularly cruel, particularly senseless. She emphasized the callousness of Daigle's actions, noting that he had shown no remorse, no hesitation, and no humanity as he murdered a man who had stopped to help him. Hall described the devastating impact on Vincent's family, who attended the trial and testified about their loss. The emotional weight of their testimony was palpable, filling the courtroom with grief and determination to see justice served. Daigle's defense attorneys argued that their client was severely intoxicated at the time of the shooting and suffering from a mental health crisis that impaired his judgment. They presented testimony from Dr. Ron Minola, a neuropsychologist who examined Daigle, and concluded that he suffered from cognitive impairments due to years of substance abuse, multiple concussions, and possible early-stage dementia. Defense expert Dr. Jeffrey Fabian stated that Daigle had suffered a mini-stroke at some point during his adult life, had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from decades of smoking, and was likely impaired by drugs and alcohol during the shooting. Fabian stated, quote, "He's also on his way to dementia, period. It's very clear," end quote. But the prosecution countered with its own expert witnesses who disputed the defense's claims. Dr. Rafael Salcido testified that Daigle was capable of forming intent and executing a plan, evidenced by his actions in searching Vincent's pockets for keys and stealing the patrol car. Dr. Melissa Piasecki, a forensic psychiatrist, stated that while Daigle's substance abuse did impact his mental state, it did not render him incapable of understanding his actions. Dr. Raphael Demonge, a neurologist, testified that there was no evidence in Daigle's medical records to prove he had brain damage from a mini-stroke, and that white matter abnormalities in his brain would not cause him to become a killer. Demonge told the jury, quote, "If you commit a murder, you have to have the ability to come up with a plan, which is a completely different section of the brain. Daigle was able to come up with a plan and knew he needed to take the trooper's keys to steal his unit and drive away," end quote. On the issue of blackouts, Demonge stated there was no evidence in the dashcam footage that Daigle was suffering from a blackout or lacked awareness of his surroundings. The prosecution argued that Daigle's actions were deliberate, calculated, and cruel, the actions of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and chose violence over cooperation. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Kevin Daigle was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Trooper Stephen Vincent. 4 days later, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Calcasieu Parish District Attorney Stephen Dwight praised the verdict, stating, quote, "They listened to the evidence and they came back with the death penalty, which I think is the appropriate response to the circumstances," end quote. Dwight called Daigle an animal and said that what he did on that day was horrible and horrific, and this is the proper justice. However, legal complications arose when it was discovered that one of the jurors may not have been qualified to serve. The state and defense reached an agreement in which the guilty verdict would stand, but the penalty phase would be redone with a new jury. In July 2022, a second jury was impaneled to determine whether Kevin Daigle should receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole. After hearing victim impact statements, expert testimony, and arguments from both sides, the second jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour before unanimously recommending the death penalty. On October 18, 2022, Judge Clayton Davis formally sentenced Kevin Daigle to death for the murder of Louisiana State Police Trooper Stephen Vincent. The sentencing brought a measure of closure for Vincent's family, though it could never restore what they had lost. Prosecutor Leah Hall said, quote, "The impact that he had upon the family was gargantuan in size, and when those victims testified about the effects that they felt, it was palpable. Everyone in the courtroom understood that loss," end quote. As of 2025, Kevin Daigle remains on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, awaiting execution. His case has become a symbol of the dangerous law enforcement officers face every day, and the ultimate sacrifice some make in service to their communities. Trooper Stephen Vincent is remembered not only for how he died, but for how he lived, with honor, courage, and an unwavering commitment to helping others. His legacy continues through the lives he touched, the family he loved, and the countless officers who carry on his mission of protecting and serving the public.